So here's a little backstory first. So this happened back in the fall of 2016. I was a newlywed, 18, and moved halfway across the country to live with my husband. I was in a new town and had no friends whatsoever. My husband, he was deployed in the early spring of 2016 too. A few months into deployment, I was getting really lonely and just wanted to head home. So I decided to make the 16-hour trek home alone, and I packed up my essentials and my cats, and I left at 11 p.m. because I couldn't sleep. I was about 4 hours into my drive, I think, and I was growing pretty tired, so I pulled into a well-lit public rest stop so that I could catch some shut-eye. I pulled my car into a spot right under a light, and I made sure cars were nearby. So it's about 3 in the morning at this time, and I fall asleep, but the next thing I know, I hear a knuckle tapping on my driver's side window. Sleepily, I wake up and see an older man, maybe about mid-40s I'd say, kneeling down to my window, and stupidly, I open my driver's side door. "Please don't shoot me, ma'am." I won't. What do you want?" My wife and I, we're stranded here and we need money. Do you have any? We're right over here." He points to the van parked in the dark off behind him at this point. "Yeah, we're just over here if you want to follow me." No, man, I'm good. I don't have any money, I'm sorry." At this point, I'm beginning to feel like something is wrong. "Oh, come on, I swear I'm up to no harm. Just come over to my van. My wife is in there." "Sorry, but I don't have any money, and I'm using the rest of my money to go home, okay?" "All right, miss, all right. God bless. God bless." And with that, he stumbles off to the next car on my right to do the same thing. But now, I'm wide awake, and quite honestly, I was feeling scared. I turn on my car eventually, and I just peel out of the lot, and I don't know what he wanted. I didn't see a woman in the van that he kept pointing at, but I know that I didn't want to find out. And to be honest with you guys, I have a hunch that that whole episode was some sort of kidnap attempt. When I was in middle school, about 11 years old at the time I'd say, I had a neighbor who lived directly across the street who barely ever came out of his house. He was a really tall and always wore black clothes, windows always dark, almost like they were boarded up from the inside or something, and it just had an uncanny creepiness about him. Most people in the neighborhood felt the same way too. Basically, the only reason people knew he existed was because he would just randomly open up his front door and walk extra slow to the mailbox and then back inside of the house, sometimes not even getting the mail. So yeah, just a really weird guy. And I was never, ever allowed to have my window blinds open, and if I was caught with mine open, my parents would scold me, and they were just really serious about that. So I was waiting at my bus stop one morning. It's about 6:45 in the morning, I think, and the sun was barely up yet. My bus stop was at the end of my driveway, only about 20 steps away from the front door to my house. While picking a song on my iPod with my headphones on, I noticed in my peripheral that creepy neighbor is walking up our street. It's a hill, and at this point he's past my driveway and going further on up the hill, but not quite to the top where it plateaus. But then he suddenly turns around and he's walking back down the hill. At first, I didn't think it was that weird because, like I said, he just does weird things often anyway. But then, I realized that he's cutting across the road diagonally, directly towards me. My brain is processing what's happening, and considering nothing had ever happened to me before that would make me be concerned for my safety or anything. I mean, the neighborhood is safe, and the fact that I was a kid and all that, I thought maybe he just wanted to talk to me or something. I must admit that I was a little scared, but for some reason, my first thought wasn't to run away or anything. And then, I hear a slam and my dad's sprinting out of the door to get me. Apparently, he was watching from the window and wasn't about to let this guy do whatever he wanted to do. I remember my dad let me stay home from school that day, and was calling around local authorities, school officials, everyone, and we even moved shortly afterwards. So, a few years go by and I get one of those sex offender apps. And it turns out that creepy guy was actually a registered sex offender, aggravated sexual assault with complaint less than 13 years of age. And he was also in possession of CP. So yeah, I don't know what he was doing crossing that road early in the morning when it was dark and heading towards me, a small 11-year-old, with nobody around and my parents not there, but whatever it was, I have to assume that it was something pretty sinister. At the time of this story, it was the summer after junior year, and a couple of my buddies and I were at someone's house doing the usual things teenagers do. After a couple of hours of Xbox and basketball, one of my friends, Sam, rolled up with a trunk full of fireworks, and we decided that it would be fun to go set them off at an empty field a mile away from the house. As we all piled into Sam's car and started driving out of the neighborhood, a man stepped onto the road and blocked our way. He was huge too and covered in tats. Probably 6'3" or so, I'd say, with the long dark hair pulled back in a ratty ponytail. Sam honked the horn as the man just stood in front of our car yelling obscenities at us. When finally, my friend has had enough and whipped the car around him while flipping the guy the bird, speeding out of the neighborhood and towards the main road. A couple of minutes later, and we got to the field and set up the fireworks. As we all hid around the edges of the grass, Sam stepped forward and lit the firework up. Seconds later, the firework ignited and exploded, much louder than any of us had expected, in fact. It was so loud, in fact, that I ran back to Sam's car with him, and he slammed on the gas and flew out of the parking lot onto the main road. As we neared the entrance to my friend's neighborhood, it dawned on Sam that he had left the rest of the guys back at the field, so he stopped the car and made me get out so that he could go retrieve the other guys. I didn't understand why I couldn't go with him, but it didn't matter. It was a nice summer night anyway, and I sat down on the sidewalk near the entrance of the neighborhood and just pulled out my phone. After a couple of minutes of phone games, it died in my hands, and I thought, shit. And I just sat back and enjoyed the weather, waiting for the headlights to come back down the road when I heard a slight noise behind me. I turned my head, expecting to see a bird or wind-blown branches or something, but the streetlight outlined the figure of a man. The man from earlier, in fact. He had crept up behind me while I was sitting there, and he locked eyes with me, and I was immediately struck by the wild look in them. Like he was both looking at me and looking through me at the same time or something. I got up and backed away slowly, and then turned and started walking away from him. He kept pace with me, though, and began to yell at me, "Hey you, get the fuck back here." I increased my pace, and he continued to match it, screaming at me the entire way, and eventually I was full out sprinting away from him, and I heard him slow down. I tore down the sidewalk back to the parking lot of the field and was reunited with my friends before relaying the story to them as well. As we drove back, we searched the area for him, but he was nowhere to be found. It dawned on me, though, that if my phone hadn't have died, I probably would not have noticed the footsteps of the man and probably would have not had such a fortunate outcome in the end. I don't know what his problem was or what he was going to try to do to me if he actually got a hold of me, but man, am I glad that my phone died that night. So, before I tell this, I think I need to give some quick background info that seems relatively important to the story. So, it's 2003 and I'm 6 years old. At the time, I lived in a small condo, 1 bedroom, 1 bath and a connected living room and kitchen with an island in between and a spiral staircase with random miscellaneous things stored under it. I was living with my dad with a mother who was out of the picture. It was Saturday, and I remember specifically watching Codename Kids Next Door on TV in the bedroom after waking up. My dad, he worked a lot of the time, but he was such a nice guy that he left the TV on Cartoon Network for me, which he knew was my favorite channel. During a commercial break, I got up to take a piss, and even though I knew I was home alone, I closed the door out of instinct. And boy, am I glad about that. The next thing that I comprehended was the sound of my incredibly noisy spiral stairs. They can be heard literally across the condo because of how small it is, and they just began to rapidly make noise that got quieter over the course of about 2 seconds, and telling me that whatever made the noise was going downstairs, and fast. As a 6-year-old, this was extremely concerning because, as I said, my dad always turned the TV on before he left for work, and I knew that he was long gone at this point. So, what did I do? Well, as any paranoid 6-year-old would do when they think that they've imagined it, I walked out of the bathroom and looked over the 3-foot-long railing across from the bathroom door and next to where you would walk down the stairs. Kind of confusing, I know, but just try to visual it, I guess, if you want. And what did I see? None other than an afraid-looking man looking into my living room, but staying hidden under the stairs. After being terrified in the bathroom, I made a distinct effort to be quiet, like a spy, I was thinking. So there was no way that he knew that I was looking at him, but more than likely, practically guaranteed in fact, knew that I was in the house somewhere. Okay, so there is a man in the house, and I can A, yell at him to leave and maybe be murdered, raped, or beaten or something. By the way, there was no exit upstairs, only a balcony with a screen door that was jammed for years, and even if I somehow got it unstuck, it's like a 15-foot drop that would be no good anyway, so the only exit in the house is the front door. It's a fire hazard, I know. Or there was option B, hide. I opted for option B, obviously. I waited for what felt like hours, but in reality was probably only about 20 minutes until I heard shuffling downstairs for about a minute. Then, the sound that I was praying for, the front door opening. I was still extremely skeptical, even thinking that it was a trap to lure me downstairs, so I stayed put upstairs. All day, in view of the TV, by the way, until my dad came home, who I didn't tell about the whole incident out of fear that I shouldn't have had, thinking that he would be mad that I didn't approach him or something. Nothing valuable was missing from the house, but you're sure as hell that I checked under those stairs every morning when I walked down them for the next 3.5 years of living in that condo. So, why was he there? I have no idea. How was he there? I have a pretty reasonable theory that, simply put, my dad forgot to lock the door behind him after he left, and this man was trying doors for some reason, and he came in and hid upstairs somewhere to do something, but got cold feet because I was a little kid. But other than that, I have no idea. All I can say is that, man, am I glad that I had that bathroom door shut, because if he had seen me directly, who knows what could have happened. Back in 2013, I was living with my ex at the time, who lived near a nice country village, and as I was in between jobs at the time, I picked up a job at a local garden centre. It was casual retail work, fairly decent pay, and easygoing enough that I could take a coffee break frequently and wear basically whatever I liked as long as I wore my work polo shirt. It was walking distance from my ex's house and full of people of all ages who were the most lovely people that I've ever met. Most of the regular customers who came to the garden centre, they were usually sweet old people who would visit the cafe because we had free tea and discounted lunches for the OAPs if they had a store card. So, you often got to know all of them, and some of them we even gave nicknames. Most of them were pretty sweet, like Pink Hair Lady. She was a badass 80-year-old grandma who wore a tasseled leather jacket and bright pink hair. But then there was Camper Van couple who used to drive a really cool camper van with bright orange flowers painted on it. You get the idea. But with Creepy Artist Man, though, he gave most of the young girls there weird vibes. He wore a straw hat, was in his late 40s, I'd say, had round gold-rimmed glasses, and would wear strange graphic shirts with naked women on them, or processional pussy patrol sort of slogans on the back and stuff. He always wore ripped jeans where his knees were always hanging out of them, which were always dirty and painted or mud or something. He had this weird half smile too that would never leave his face, and kind of a leer that made people feel uncomfortable. He would take off his glasses and clean them constantly, which kind of made you feel like he was trying to get a better look at the girls who worked there or something. Especially the younger ones, 16-plus school leavers usually. Anyway, it was a roasting hot summer's day, and I had gratefully accepted the job of watering the hanging baskets outside where I could avoid the humid, sweaty heat of the greenhouses. I was wearing black shorts and my red polo and my tool belt to prune and deadhead the plants as I went. With the hose in my hand and sunnies on my face, I was busy but enjoying the solitary job at the quietest part of the garden centre. And then I heard, well, hello there. Out of practically nowhere too, he slipped out behind some wooden trellises and looked me up and down, smiling with this weird, too small teeth. His eyes lingered on me for what felt like an uncomfortable few seconds, and I turned off my hose and asked him if he needed anything. He shook his head and kind of shrugged, still smirking at my legs too. I said to him, "Okay, sir, have a nice day. Let me know if you need anything," and I turned to continue. He says, "I've never seen you here before. You're a new one, right?" I say, "Huh, me? Well, I've been here for 8 months now." He says, "I must have missed the memo that a beauty like you started here. You have a nice tan. You look young." I say, "Thanks, I'm 23. Anyways, I have to go back to work." And he says, "Nice to meet you," and quotes my name. I suddenly remember my name badge, and I get slightly irritated that he now knew my full name. I make a beeline for the smoking area where the tool shed was with an excuse to grab some smaller gardening gloves, and by the time I returned to the floor, he had left, thankfully. As the weeks went by, he would come into the store regularly, usually mid-afternoon I'd say, coincidentally, or so I thought, around the time that I started my shift. Most of the time, I was the only cashier, so I would have to serve him. He would buy the most just smallest pointless things like florist wire or a tiny bag of birdseed, and it seemed like he would purposely make a purchase with the intention of interacting with me. He would make comments about my appearance, statements mostly like, "You have your hair different today, yesterday you had it down, you have new glasses," or "That's a different lip color to yesterday." He would always announce my name loudly and deliberately during every interaction too, and I felt really uncomfortable, but I was 23 and I kind of just politely shrugged it off at the time. Around Christmas time, I was decorating the artificial trees, and he cornered me in the forest of them at the back of the store. He jumped out from behind one, and he actually made me jump, to which I was kind of pissed about him doing because I dropped a glass ornament and it had smashed. He bent down also and tried to help, grabbing my wrist and telling me not to touch the glass. His grip was actually scarily tight and forceful, and his hands were clammy and gross too. I slipped my hand out of his grip and asked if I could help him with anything, and that's when it got weird. He pulled out a leaflet from his back pocket and told me that he was an artist and had a Christmas art show happening in the local church hall, and he wanted me to go with him. He told me that he was a painter and thought that I would like his work. I had never indicated that I was interested in art, to him or anyone else for that matter, which is why I thought it was strange. I asked him if he wanted to pin the leaflet to the local event board, and he reached out and touched my arm and said no. The invitation is specifically for you. He pointed his finger and jabbed it to my breast, and then he said, "You." So I'm standing there in a dark corner, obscured from view by artificial Christmas trees, just kind of cornered by this guy who was touching me at this point. I kind of just cringed away and said I was busy with my boyfriend that day, sorry, and kind of just scampered off at that point. I remember feeling really strange after that though. The fact that he grabbed my wrist and jabbed his finger into my chest that way. I told a few of my colleagues about it, and they told me that they would warn me next time he was in the store so that I could maybe hang out in the storeroom until he was gone. Well, that memo must have been missed by a few of the temp Christmas staff, because one day I get told by one, "Your friend is asking for you at the tills." It wasn't totally unusual for my friends to stop by, as it was a fairly popular for gift store, so thinking it was maybe my ex's mum or something, I head to the till, and there he is. And he's holding a piece of paper. I cringe, but he had seen me now, so I walk over and ask what he needed from me. He passed the paper over and asked me to open it. Folded up was a drawing of me with exaggerated breasts and cartoon-like eyes, watering with hanging baskets in a sexual kind of position. I kind of stood there and I said thank you out of just a knee-jerk response, but I couldn't keep it, as I thought it was inappropriate to take gifts from customers and all. I handed it back to him, and he kind of looked at me with this angry stare. He turned around and walked out just without another word. By this point, I had had enough, to be honest, and I knocked on my manager's door and told him about the whole scenario that had just happened and all the previous interactions that I'd had with him over the past year. He watched the CCTV and agreed that it was really strange that he gave me this gross picture, and told me that he could talk to him if he came back. He praised me for my reaction to his advances and said that I was doing the right thing, and he would try and see him off next time if there was a next time. So the next day was Sunday, and I wasn't due to work. My boss calls me and tells me that he just received a call from HQ stating that an anonymous caller had called in to report a staff member inappropriately coming onto a customer. The staff member that they described and named was me. The caller had said that I had been inappropriate towards him at work, offered to have sex with him, had led him on, and obviously was promiscuous, and that I had been pursuing him for over a year now. The jerk even described a fictitious relationship we had had and ranted loudly about how I'd been cheating on my boyfriend before hanging up. HQ luckily didn't believe a word, as my manager had already mentioned the guy to one of the higher-ups, but they thought it was wise to let me know about this crazy guy and suggest that I report it to the police at this point. The next day, I did just that. The officer I spoke to said that he actually matched the description of a man who was just a local pest, somebody who would often harass young girls in the local area, and he was also known to stalk girls in his car and had even attempted to abduct a young girl 4 years ago. Holy shit, right? The police officers assured me that they would file the report and talk to him officially, and that he was not allowed in the garden centre or anywhere near me again, and if he did, I was to call the police and he would actually be arrested. Unfortunately, though, it never stopped him sending a ranting letter to my workplace, addressed to me, saying that he was going to end himself if I didn't take him back and receive his gift that he drew of me. Fortunately, the police saw this as unsolicited contact, and he was thankfully arrested. I don't know where he is and whatever happened to him, but the fact that he actually tried to abduct a young girl 4 years ago is creepy, to say the least. So my husband, kid, and I, we live out in the middle of nowhere on a plot of land that's about 100 acres, I'd say. There's probably about 95 of those acres that are wilderness with just ATV and hiking trails that we and several of the other previous owners created by exploring. We use that land for camping and hiking and hunting, and we'd like to find a spot, just clear it a bit and camp overnight with not much else with us. There's so much space that we've never stayed in the same place twice, in fact. We've seen some kill sites, both old and fresh, lots of animal tracks, places where deer bed down, etc., and I've even spent a lot of time hiking solo while the kids are in school and husband's at work and whatnot. Whether alone or with family, we always carry a firearm for protection, though. A few weeks ago, we decided to load up on some camping gear and start a new trail. We marked the trails that we make with spray paint on trees. We were pretty far in the woods, having hiked almost an hour now, when The atmosphere just seemed to change. I don't know who noticed it at first, but my husband, who was leading the three of us, turned around and gave me a concerned look. The birds had stopped chirping at this point, and the insects, they had gone quiet. There were just absolutely no sounds around us at all. And when in the woods, complete quietness is rarely a good thing. We continued onward, though, hyper-aware of our surroundings, while our kids continued merely talking. We came to the stream that marks the midway point of our property, and we stopped for a few minutes. And my husband and I, we just kind of stare each other down. We both just felt like something was off, but didn't want to scare our daughter. Eventually, I finally broke the silence and said I suddenly didn't feel good and we should just go home. My husband nodded in agreement while our daughter voiced her protest, but too bad, kiddo. We turned around and we started back. After going a few hundred yards, still in the silent wilderness, mind you, I looked to my right and I saw a person crouched down in a ghillie suit about 150 feet off the trail. I'm positive that they saw that I noticed them too, but they never moved. I cleared my throat to get my husband's attention, and when he looked back, I put my hand on the gun in my holster on my hip, which caused him to readjust his rifle in preparation of anything. I sped up my family and we hurried back home, and I told my husband as soon as we were inside. We decided to call the police and report the trespasser, and filed a report and was told to call again if we saw anyone. A few days later, my husband and I went out alone and set up a bunch of deer cams. We didn't go back out into the woods for maybe a week, and then he and I ventured out to retrieve the cam footage. Out of the 9 cams that we placed, we caught a person in a ghillie suit in 2 images. We handed copies over to the cops to go with our report, and we haven't gone back out since except to check the deer cams. We haven't gotten any other trespassers pretty much ever, and it freaks me out even more to think of the few times while camping that we actually heard walking near our tent in the middle of the night. We always assumed that it was just curious animals, but now I'm not so sure anymore. My mother and father had been separated since I was about 1 or 2 years old, I'd say. And I visited my father occasionally during the summers while I lived with my mother. But for some reason, my mum believed that it was a great idea to send me to my father's this summer. And this, despite at the time, he didn't even have an official place to stay because he had gotten kicked out of his home a few weeks after I'd gotten there. And so, he resorted to staying with a friend that he had met at a past homeless shelter, Pete. Now, Pete's home on the surface looked decent, and even though he seemed odd, nothing rang any real bells, and he seemed pretty much okay. The first night that I knew something was wrong, though, is when I fell asleep in his bed. That night, I woke up with bedbug bites just all over me. I mean, they were just literally everywhere. When I first complained to my dad about the bites too, Pete was a bit upset and said, "My bed don't got any bed bugs, you must have bought them in." And he was just in absolute denial at that point. Another side note, my dad left for work, leaving me alone with Pete for 8 to 12 hours a day sometimes. After a few days of being there, I started to get more restless too, because Pete would sometimes make suggestive comments toward me that he had sexual implications, or would just refuse to let me eat anything until my dad came home. For many of those wondering why I didn't tell my dad was, well, because I assumed that if we didn't stay here, that he would end up living on the streets, and I'd rather deal with this asshole than live in a cardboard box, right? However, one day, I was a bit more talkative than usual. Mind you, at this time I hadn't slept for around 21 hours and hadn't ate for half that time. I was exhausted, but the bedbug bites constantly made me itchy, and I couldn't sleep, and I just had to talk. I don't remember completely how it even got to this point, but all I can remember is that I was in the bathroom. So, at some stage, I think I possibly told Pete that I was just fed up with him and would tell my dad. And as I closed the door behind me, he suddenly came charging in like a bull. I tried locking the door, but he wouldn't let me close it. A 12-year-old versus a grown man? I didn't stand a chance strength-wise. Now, my mum constantly trained and drilled into my head that adults, they can be dangerous. That you should never get into someone's car and, in her own words, if they got you in the car, play along and then grab the steering wheel and try and crash the car. It's better to die than have them get you to the second location. No matter what, even if you have to risk your life, never let them get power or take you into that second location. I remember going into instinct mode and I grabbed the razor that he left on his sink, and Pete was screaming things like, "I'll kill you," and just other shit like that mixed in with just swear words. I remember I stupidly dropped my phone near the toilet, but opened the door and slipped beneath Pete's arms. I sprinted for the door and he caught me and slammed me into the wall. I remember slicing his arm with a razor when he tried to strangle me and getting up and just running outside of his house. He wasn't able to catch me at that point, and then I made another stupid mistake. Some old guy beneath our floor kind of knew my dad and offered me to stay at his house and wait for him to get home. Guys, I know that this was dumb to accept, but I was tired and hungry and just wasn't thinking straight. When he had made me a sandwich and gave me a blanket to sleep on his couch, I was thinking, what if he poisoned this food or was going to try and rape me when I fell asleep or something? Imagine, a 12-year-old thinking about all of this already. What a world we live in, right? Next thing I knew, I fell asleep with the razor clutched into my hands. Yeah, I fell asleep in this man's house who I didn't even know. I couldn't even call my dad because my phone had fallen somewhere in his house during all the scuffle and everything. But eventually, my dad got home and immediately threatened Pete, grabbed our things, and we went to a motel until I was able to go back to my mother's place. Needless to say, that was the worst summer of my entire life.